Hello again and welcome to the chapter about positional defense. In this chapter, I would like to focus on defensive situations where it's not really about our king being in danger. It's more about some kind of long-term inferiority. For example, the opponent has more space, they have a better pawn structure, maybe we have a weak square somewhere, or maybe we are sitting with a bad piece that we really need to think about how to activate it and so on. In this sense, speaking about positional defense, I think that the ideas that we can use are basically the same that we could rely on if we were having an advantage. So I don't think there's a big difference between being better or worse as for the tools that we can use in our play. So what I'm going to do here, I would like to rely on the ideas that I outlined in Mastering Chess Strategy. And these are basically four, speaking of positional play. We talk about improving the pieces, about exchanges, pawn play, which can be many different things like betting on the passed pawns or weakening the opponent's pawn structure. And finally, we have the last group, which I call prophylaxis, but in this group we can also find restriction and provocation. We will come to that in the end of this chapter. And speaking of the end of this chapter, there I would also like to quickly talk a little about the connection between strategy and tactics over the board. So let's get started. In our first example, we will talk a little about how to improve the pieces. I would like to show one example per piece, so to speak. In our first example, it's an old example, but it's the one that I like very much. Mikhail Tal with the white pieces and Miguel Najdorf playing black. So what we have here is a position where you can quickly see that white's pawn structure is better. You can see that black has weaknesses on c6 and a6, and also there is a weak square on c5. On the other hand, opposed to most of the other chapters here in this course, you can see that the king is not really a problem at this point. The nature of black's defense, it's about something else here. We would like to avoid getting ridden down. White will profit from those weaknesses. Maybe they will take one of these pawns in the very end, or something will happen on the queen side. Maybe you remember some games by Rubinstein where he would know exactly how to work against such weaknesses. He would put the rook on c5 and a5. Yeah, we can't do that right now, but later maybe if the bishops are traded off and so on. So what we have to do here is we have to somehow improve our position. Now, maybe we won't reach full equality, but we have to find some kind of way of putting obstacles in white's way. That's what I would think. I mean, there is a different kind of mindset, you could say, when you just stubbornly defend your weaknesses. But I know that sometimes this can be the only way out, but on other occasions, it's not the only choice. On other occasions, we can try to find some more active defense, like in endgames, where we talk a lot about active defense, putting the rook in the back of the passed pawns and things like that. So something like that happened here. Najdorf noticed that there was one piece that he could try to improve in this position. You can see that also pawn play. There aren't many like pawn breaks or things like that with black. Not too many dynamic plans. But what we can do here, we can improve one of our pieces. Maybe you're slightly surprised. You would say, hey, but that piece is well placed in the center. But it's not doing too much. Exactly, we're talking about the knight. It's not that active, as you can see. It can't go to g4, the pawn on e4 is protected, it can't go to d5 and so on. So what did Najdorf do? Well, he rerouted the knight and he looked at the structure, and probably he recognized this structure from other openings like the King's Indian, and he saw that, okay, if that knight could fly, it would really love to fly to d4. I mean, it's not, of course, sure that Najdorf would think exactly with those words. I'm just saying what maybe I would think if I was sitting there in Najdorf's place. So he would like to bring the knight to d4. And as you can see, this kind of thinking, you can also use it easily in superior positions, which is why I'm saying that I don't see a big difference between the way we think when we're better or worse. It's just about improving the position, and we'll see how far it gets. So, okay, let's see what happened in the game. You got it. If we want to move the knight to d4, it's far away. That's what I call the magic distance in an endgame perspective. But what we can do here, we can start rerouting it similar to such maneuvers in the King's Indian, for example. Najdorf played here knight h7. You can see that it can go this way, or it could go the other way, depending on white's play. But usually when you have two choices regarding a knight's route, try to go for the more active one. If you go by g5, for example, this means that you will also attack the pawn on h3. So you win an extra tempo, or you even confuse your opponent a little instead of going this way. Of course, if they go like h4, in that case, we could go the other way. Sorry, to this side, I mean. Let's see what happened in the game. Tal played bishop c5, trying to trade off. defender on e7. Black cannot really avoid that. Knight of played clever move here, bishop e8, defending on our terms, you could say. If they want to trade, well, we will take back like that. We won't ourselves take on c5 because that would just help white's knight to get closer. So bishop e8, rook ed1, fighting for the open file. Rook takes, so that we keep the rook on the b file, putting some slight pressure on this side. Rook takes d1 and knight c5. We talked about this, choosing the most active route for the knight. Bishop takes e7, queen takes e7, knight c5, and here Najdorf simply continued with his plan here, knight e6. As you can see, if the knight reaches d4, it will be a completely different story. It will definitely put a lot of obstacles in white's play. So Tal hurried to take on e6. If he takes on a6, by the way, it's always good to check the tactics, of course, but as you can see here, we could go in two ways, but I think it was smarter to go in this way. Yeah, why was that smarter, by the way? Probably because we will put the queen on that side. Yeah, exactly. So if bishop f1 protecting the knight, we go like that, and now it's nicer, of course, to attack it from this way. So I think we get back the pawn here, actually. We can play knight e4 when the knight retreats, and we can take the pawn and so on whenever the knight goes back. So yeah, good calculation here by Najdorf, knight e6. So Tal had to take on e6, and after queen takes e6, you can see that black has improved quite a lot. It's not that what can you say, not that vulnerable their kings are anymore. White is perhaps not sitting with the most active minor piece. The bishop is not that strong for now. They played in the game b3, safeguarding the queenside pawns. And I think here there was a minor inaccuracy by black. They played queen e7, and after queen c3, Tal had a nice advantage here. He went on to win later on. The queen can sometimes go to a5 and so on. But there was an interesting option for black here if we go back to this position after b3. What do you think about pawn trades? Is there any possibility to reduce the number of pawns on the board? Aha, exactly. We saw this actually in another example, if you remember, in the chapter about sacrifices in the defense. In the game Guriatsky-Guseynov, Guseynov played a5, a4 at some point, and we could actually use the same idea here. So this is about pawn play, you could say. Now we speak a little about pawn play also within defensive, within the defensive task. So what black is about to do here, they're about to play a4, trying to trade off the pawns. That would be great, because if we achieve that, we are fixing a weakness on white's camp, no matter how they react. So I looked at a few different variations here. Queen c3 was my main move. We could play a4, but after pawn takes, queen takes, they can play a5, and they have rook a1 coming up. Slightly unpleasant, they have this passed pawn. So I think it's better to, after queen c3, play rook a8 first. And now we're getting ready to play a4. And even if they go b4, we could play a3. We are fixing a pawn like that. We talked about this several times already. That would be very beneficial, even far into the endgame. So maybe something like bishop f1, bringing in the bishop. We go a4. They can play bishop c4. And yeah, we can maybe take this pawn. I don't know if they can take maybe on e5. But we can also play it safe here. We can play queen e7. And I think black is doing fine. As I was saying, if b4, we can go a3. Perhaps white is still a bit better, but it's not that much. Maybe we can try to trade off the bishop at some point, if we can fix the problem with this pawn and so on. Maybe we can put pressure on this pawn on b4 also. So basically, that's one way you can see how we can improve our defensive situation. Perhaps we're still a little worse, but it's not that difficult anymore. What we have seen here is that white had a very pleasant queenside grip. What Najdorf hurried to do here was to improve his, you could say, I wouldn't say his worst piece, but he improved the piece which he noticed had a great potential, and that's the knight. So he played here the move knight h7, getting ready for this nice knight maneuver. If necessary, we can also go that way, targeting the outpost, you could say, on the d4 square. All right, let's see another example featuring another piece. This is a more modern game. We have with the white pieces Panzer, and playing black is Fedorchuk. So we have some kind of stone wall structure. You can see here black has played d takes e4, and black has more space. You can also say that their knight is about to come to d5. That's a nice place for that knight. At the same time, we can notice that white's both bishops are not very active. This bishop, maybe we can later on try to play f3, open up the game for it. But on the other hand, this bishop is really passive. The bishop on e1 is very passive. And that's what Panzer addressed with his next move. He found a way to improve that bishop quickly, and he played here the move b5. So the point is clear. Apart from gaining some space, we are getting ready to improve our bishop in this way. Sometimes, as you can see, the pawns can help the pieces to improve also. So what happened here was that black played knight e5, and Panzer understood very well this position, because he saw that if you compare black's three minor pieces, if we compare these three pieces, we ask ourselves which is the most important one, which is the most powerful one. I think most of us would consider that it's of course impossible to know, there is no way to find out, but I think if we analyze this position, we assess it, we would say that, oh, this knight is very strong. That's probably their best piece. And then perhaps in second place, you would say it's that bishop, and probably the problem child here for black is the bishop on d7. So in this sense, even if you do the same thing with white, you will probably notice also that the knight is probably, just like in black's case, the knight is probably the strongest piece, the knight on e5, I mean, and probably the worst piece is the bishop on e1. So that explains more or less the way of thinking. Now, if you have three candidates, or what would you say, two groups of, two teams, yeah, two teams. You have two teams, you make a little list among those teams about the three members. You would say that, all right, I'm trading my worst piece for their best piece. That can't be a bad business, right? So he played here bishop b4. Very nice. You can see tactically well founded. If black denies the change, well, the trade, well, then there is knight f7. So they really have to take on b4. Knight takes, queen takes. Very simple. Now white can already be quite happy here. They don't have any bad pieces anymore. Black still sits with this bishop on d7, which is not a great piece. They played a6, trying to open up that bishop. I thought about b6 to go rook c7, but in the game they played something else. One theory is that in the event of b6, maybe bishop e7, and you try to bring the bishop to d6 and you cover this square. So what he played was fine also. He played b takes a6, opening up space on the queen side. After b takes, he played here knight takes d7. And after queen takes d7, yeah, why do we trade a knight? Well, simply because after e3, we can improve our bishop in a way that they probably can't. We can double up the rooks, or maybe put the rooks like that. We can put the bishop on this side. It can come to c4. It can target the e6 pawn. It can target, yeah, the a6 pawn as well. Black cannot really do anything similar. It's very hard to believe that they will be able to do something like that, because the king side will also become very weak. So in a way, he did something clever here. He didn't look at the pieces which left. He looked at which stayed. But it's possible that you could play in some other way also. Queen d6 was another candidate move. In any way, I think what he played was not bad. Queen takes e3, a5, queen c4 was played here. Another interesting move was queen b6, but queen c4 is also making sense. Maybe black should have played rook fc8 to fight for the open file. In the game they played a4, and what do you think white played next here? That's right. Now we're definitely beyond defensive play. We're talking about how to squeeze in this kind of superior position long term. Queen c6, exactly, targeting the pawn on e6 in this case. It's getting uncomfortable to play this with the black pieces. They played in the game queen e7 and rook c4, targeting the other pawn as well. a3, rook b1. Later on, rook b7 is about to be played. So white was slightly better here. The game ended in a draw, but this is basically the kind of, you could say, metamorphosis that we can bring about if we consider the relative activity of the pieces and so on. In this case, the bishop was not very active on e1, so Panzer hurried to play here b5, very clever move so that the bishop can enter. We activate this piece, and we're ready to trade it off, which we will come to, by the way, later in this chapter, trades. So let's see another example about another piece which can be improved. This is a surprising example. If you look at this position for the first time, it's from actually theoretical variation in the French with, I think, knight c3, knight f6, bishop d5, d takes, knight b d7, something like that. If you see this position, you'll say, but what did black do wrong in this game? They lost the right to castling, white has a space advantage, the rooks are disconnected and so on. But actually black is perfectly fine here. They just have to do something unusual. We tend to improve our rooks, we tend to activate our rooks by using open files and so on. Castling is good for activating the rooks, of course, but here black can't do any of that. So what do you think? How did they activate the rook on h8? How can we bring this problem piece into the battle? Exactly, they played here h5. I'm not sure who who invented this move, who found it in the first place. But in any case, here we have with the white pieces Petr Leko, and playing black is Mikhail Gurevich. So Gurevich played h5, you can see the idea, h4, if possible h3, of course, fantastic to soften up white's kingside. But on the other hand, to bring in the rook would also be another idea. You would say, but white can just play h4. Well, there are some small tactical nuances here. Black would play something like king g8. Now, if white wants to castle, they would have to play g3 first to secure this pawn. Else, black will take it, not so much for the pawn, but in order to later on continue with this business of pushing the h-pawn. So g3, and here black has something connected to pawn play. They have a surprising idea based on pawn play. So what do you think black should play here? What does this mean, by the way? Yeah, I'm actually not talking about the king side, I'm talking about the queen side. That's right, they can play this move, b6. Surprising, no, why on earth would you play that? Isn't there something going on the c file? Well, there are some tactics here. When black plays this move, they are basically interested in softening up the pawn structure on white's queen side. Now if white takes on b6, we have queen b7, protecting the rook and also targeting the rook, which means that we can next turn take back on b6, and we have some more space for our pieces in this way. Also the rook becomes stronger. So that was the deep idea here also, or little detail you could say, with this move, h5, that if white answers in the same way, well, in that case, they will need an extra tempo on g3 to castle, and for that reason, we can, first king g8 makes sense to improve the king, and later on try to play b6 to open up, because we have this little tactical idea. Anyway, castles was played in the game, h4, we talked about this. Black would like to play h3, it's good in every context, you would say, in attacking context, in endgame context, and so on. Looking at the color of the bishops also, you would say, of course, it's favorable for us to put the pieces on, the pawns on light squares. So h3 was played, and what do you think Gurevich played next? That's completely right. He sticking to the topic here, rook h5, improving the rook. Once that rook enters, we don't complain about having lost the right to castle anymore. Rook fe1 and a6, black plays like that because they want to liberate the rook from the defense of the a-pawn, queen b3, and after rook d8, black's slowly starting to play for the open file, the only open file here, the d file. Of course, white would love to push their queenside pawn majority. That's a major strength, you can say, in that position, but it's difficult because the pawn on c5 will always be a little shaky, you know. So not so simple for white, this situation. Leko played in very solid style, a3 after king g8. It was possible to play rook f5 as well. Rook c2, rook f5, bishop c1, a lot of prophylaxis from white also. And at this point, black takes the opportunity to actually seize the initiative. They played here knight f4. Very nice, you can see the knight is getting ready to enter on d3 perhaps at some point, or maybe even rook d3 can come up. Black should also look a little at the king side, perhaps some tactic going on. Anyway, white took on f4, and after rook takes f4, knight e5. What do you think black played next? Which would you think would be the final destiny? Well, not final, but for now, a good destiny for our unusual rook, the rook that improved along the h-file. Exactly, we can play here rook fd4. That's what Gurevich played, definitely taking command of the open file. And probably it's black who is better here in this position. At some point maybe we can go rook d2, or we can play maybe bishop f6. We have a nice initiative here thanks to the control of the open file. Who could think that about this rook, which traveled from h8? It was black's worst piece, but I would say now it's perhaps their best piece. So basically what they did here, they couldn't develop the rook in a normal way. They could have tried, of course, something like g6 and king g7. It was possible. It's not unthinkable to play something like that. But it's a much nicer way of playing what he did in the game, because also this h-pawn, it adds like some extra spice to the position. So here we have a little about pawn play also, you could say. We're gaining space. That's one typical typical facet of pawn play, that we try to get some more space for our pieces. When we push a pawn, the squares behind it become available for our pieces. So that's also what he's considering here to play, rook h5, rook f5. So that's about the rook. Let's switch topics. Let's go to the second group. We were mentioning the idea of changes, piece trades. That's what we have in our next example, in the following examples. Here in this game between with the white pieces, Abdusatorov, and playing black is Mechedlishvili. Mechedlishvili notices that in this situation he has a problem piece. Aha, exactly. If you play the French, you're used to this. this bishop on d7. I think it's a caro-can, but still it's some kind of French-like position. The bishop is not so nice on d7. It's blocked by their own pawns, restricted by the pawns on e6 and d5. And we cannot say the same thing about white's bishop, right? That's a strong bishop. Right now, white, they don't really have a big attack or anything, but in the long term, white's position is healthier now. One thing they could like to do, they would like to do, maybe to gain some space on the king side. Maybe they can go for g4, f5, but later, no. Another reasonable plan, something like f4, queen e3, maybe try to bring the knight to d4, something like that. But they will always like to keep black's bishop on the board, this bishop on d7 on the board, because it's not a very prominent piece in this structure. And that explains next move, the black's next move here. Of course, we can get rid of that bishop. Black play here the move bishop b5. Very clever in this way. We don't care about the double pawns. We just want to get that bishop off the board. And then I would dare to say that maybe the knight is slightly more clever than the, so to speak, good bishop in white's camp. Because this knight can, for example, attack the pawn on e5. So yeah, bishop e5 in any case, that's the best move here for black. That's what happened in the game. White, after taking on b5, black took with the queen because they know that ultimately their king might be prone to some danger here. If you take with the pawn, there is one interesting plan here, bishop e1, protecting the pawn on a2, but getting ready to swing a rook to the king side. White will have some chances for an attack here after all. So it's actually nicer to take with the queen. We win at tempo, you could say. Because we're offering the trade of queens now. So white didn't want to trade queens in that case, as you can see. It's a nice game for black. The knight can come here, maybe we can play b4, targeting the pawn on a3. I guess white will have to play a3 at some point. So yeah, in the game, Abdusattorov played bishop d3, keeping the queens on the board. And where do you think black put their queen? Aha, it's a nice place. If the opponent has a light squared bishop, you look for dark squares to have your queen working on those squares where it cannot be opposed. Queen b6 is what they played. In this way also, they fight a little against this plan of f4, and they keep an eye on the pawn on b2, just in case white will play something like queen h5 or something. Maybe you have like g6 and the pawn is hanging on b2 and things like that. g3 was played in the game. Solid choice by Abdusattorov. This is what we call prophylaxis, right? He's slowly reinforcing his position with g3, king g2, and so on. Rook f7, king g2, rook af8. Both players are playing in prophylactic fashion, you could say. If f4, yeah, I looked at this also. I think what black could consider here is knight f5. So we have the idea of the fork on e3, and if white takes, black takes back. I would say this kind of pawn structure, maybe you could claim that it's still better for white. On the other hand, minor pieces are usually needed in this structure for it to be really favorable for you. In a pawn endgame, for example, it's not clear what's going on because black has a protected passed pawn, although it's true that white could try to play g4, f5. But in any case, as long as there are heavy pieces on the board, I think black is perfectly fine here. It's difficult for white to improve, and also they have to keep track of these squares. I mean, they have like a space advantage, but they have to keep control of all these squares. So black's chances here should not be underestimated. Even moves like g5 might come up, some kind of pawn break. So unclear to me that white has an advantage here. I think black would be okay. In the game, white played h4, trying to gain more space. Black played g6. This is a clever move because if h5, they can actually take on h5, which looks a little ugly, but I think, yeah, white cannot take because the pawn on f2 is hanging, right? So it's not clear that white will actually get back the pawn after g takes h5. We can even play maybe h4 and try to tear up their kingside protection. No, black's pieces are well coordinated here, so I think that's a nice little detail. You would say g6, ugly move, I'm weakening my king, but actually it's not really true. We are fighting against the opponent's plan in this case. Like prophylactic thinking again. Let them do what they wanted to do, but with less effect than desired. So bishop e1 was played by Abdusattorov, and here Mkhedishvili played knight f5. And I think black has no big problems here. The game was later drawn. You can see that they were very happy, black in this case, about having traded off their problem bishop, and white were never close to putting a knight on d4. I think I looked at this also at the beginning here in this example. I had some variation. Yeah, which was my variation? Yeah, if you play something like rook c8 here, white could go rook f e1 so that we are not pinned anymore, you could say, or skewered, bishop e5, and now we don't trade anymore, so you can see the difference here. Knight f5, if black plays like in the game, now white could take on f5, rook takes, and rook d4. This is more or less what white was hoping for, as you can see. Some kind of good knight versus bad bishop scenario. Alright, I agree, the bishop is not that bad after all, but the knight is somehow nicer, and maybe, just maybe, you get a chance to later on push away the bishop and try to reroute the knight somehow, maybe to that square also. So this is more or less what black would like to avoid in the game. They avoided it by trading off the bishop as soon as possible. Bishop e5, key move, we want to get rid of that bishop. We want to have white trade off their good knight for that bishop. Or the bishop also, bishop d3, we're happy to trade also. So yeah, about getting rid of your inferior pieces, you could say. Next example, it's rather similar, but it's still maybe an even more convincing example, you could say, because here in this game between with the white pieces Sargsyan and playing black is Gukesh, if you just look at the pawn structure, you quickly notice what's going on here. If you look at the distribution of the pawns, so to speak, you see that black has 4 pawns on the queen side, but it's like in the exchange Roy Lopez. These pawns are double, and it's difficult to create a passed pawn on this side because white can hold them down. If white gets to play b3, for example, even if black gets b5 in, maybe they won't be able to create a passed pawn, right? White will never undouble their pawns, so to speak. On the other hand, you can see white has a healthy passed pawn in the center. And not only that, if you scan the board for outposts and weak squares and so on, you quickly notice that, there is a weak square on d6. Who would like to settle there? The knight, of course. White would just love to plant the knight on d6. So this means that long term, you could say black is in some kind of inferiority here in this position. What Gukesh noticed was that the presence of knights, it plays a big role here, because since white has this knight square and black has no equivalent square for their knight is basically passive on d7. So what he said was, okay, I would love to trade off the knights, but of course, if queen takes, they have queen takes d7. Oh, this looks dangerous. But then he got himself to calculate a little, and he noticed that, of course, I should do this. I can get away with it. Then that I don't have that long-term inferiority anymore. I have some tactical issues maybe, but these I can cope with. But the other situation is just like a slow death, you could say. If you play something like rook e7 here, white could play b3. I think this is what I looked at. Yeah, and look at this position. It's white who will press here the whole game. They can plant a knight whenever they like on d6. Black can hardly move in this position. So yeah, you know by now what he played. Of course, he took on c4. This was the key move, because he noticed after queen takes d7, he can go back with the queen f7. He sets up the threat of mate in 2 moves, which means that white would have to trade off the queens. Well, they can also retreat the queen, that's true. In the game, Sargsyan played e6. If he goes back with the queen, yeah, I think I looked a little at this also, right? If you go back with the queen to d2, black could play rook e6. And here you have a slight difference, or a big difference with the other situation, the initial position, because now, as you can see, there is not this knight move anymore. So white is better still here, but it's not so much. We can play rook f8. The rook is actually a good blockader when there are not minor pieces around. You could say it cannot be attacked. So white would be slightly better, but black could definitely hold in this position. It's still manageable, this inferiority. So in the game, after the strong move, queen takes e4, queen takes d7, queen f7, white played e6. But now after queen takes d7, e takes, rook d8, you can see that things are not that bad for black. Please notice that when the opponent has an advanced passed pawn like this one, if we are on the other side, we're very happy to trade off the queens. Usually, presence of queens make any passed pawn stronger, because a passed pawn can be so easily assisted by a queen. And you can't bring in the king easily. Here, black can actually bring in the king as soon as they get their pieces organized, like with rook f7 first, tying down white's rooks to the pawn on d7, then they can bring in the king. And that's happening in the game. It's not that interesting, perhaps, this part. Rook d1, yeah, you can see rook e7 is not making too much sense. Sorry. So rook d1, rook f7, tying down white, rook e d3, and now b5. Strong move, because we want to trade off pawns and make this a draw in the end. You can also bring in the king, but we can do that a little later when we don't even have to think about rook d6, right? If b3, what do you think black would play? I don't have to ask you twice. Of course, you know this from pawn endgames, the breakthrough, no? c4 to create a passed pawn on a4, and we managed to improve our pawn structure. So in the game, they took on b5, 8x b5, c takes b5, rook d5. Now we have simplification coming up here. b4, as you can see, when white takes that pawn, black will take a pawn as well. If rook takes e5, yeah, exactly. We take on d7, rook f takes d7, rook takes e5, and you can see black gets back the pawn here by check and take the pawn on b2. So c takes b4 was played in the game. C takes b4, b3, king f6. Black is coming close with king. Yeah, he tried for many moves here, Saxian, to win this game, but it was very difficult, of course. Black is close to taking the pawn. White can chase away the king, sorry. They can go back with the rook and chase away the king, but then it's not easy for them to progress. So in the end, this game was drawn. So what we saw here simply was that Gukers had to see which pieces should stay, which pieces should go, and he noticed that it was actually very useful if he could get rid of the knights in this position, because white has an outpost, which black doesn't have. So he hurried to take on c4, and it's also good to notice that we should go back with the queen here, because we're happy to trade off the queens. If the opponent has a passed pawn like that, trading queens is great. We can bring in our king, and also, of course, rook endgames. These are really the kind of endgames that we are looking for when we are worse. So this was very clever play by him. I think it was the only chance, honestly, to save the game, what he did here, in the long run, I mean. Okay, let's continue. Our next example, it brings us to an interesting topic within positional defense, when you have an isolated queen's pawn. This happens in a wide range of openings, both with white and with black. As for my experience, when you get it with white, you very often get attacking chances. If you play the Queen's Gambit accepted or the Panov attack in the Caro-Kann, you very often manage to bring up some attacking play with, the battery along the b1, h7 diagonal. There are ideas like you can bring in the rook, like rook e1, rook e3, rook h3, things like that, knight e5. A lot of attacking ideas for white in the IQP positions. But as I can see it in today's practice, when it's black who is sitting with IQP, very often they are rather confined to defending play or defensive play. It's not the same thing, it seems. Since white has an extra tempo, there are different things will happen. Now, sometimes white managed to bring out the bishop like that, bishop g5, h4, g3, no attack anymore. In the Tarrasch Rubinstein variation, they play g3, bishop g2, difficult to get at white's king, and so on. So I think in this sense, when you're playing with the black pieces in the IQP structure, very often you have to be a little more like defense-minded. And so if you get into this kind of situation, it's good to know which are like your priorities and so on. I would say, basically, when we speak about the pieces within the IQP structure, when we speak about the minor pieces, knights rule. Knights are very strong in this structure, both for the side with the IQP as for the side who's fighting against the IQP. The side who has the IQP, it likes to use these squares. And the side against it, of course, d4 is a great square, but also like f4 in this case, as you can see here. So it's a knight-friendly structure, I would say. If you're defending with IQP, try to keep the knights. The bishop is not that powerful in this structure for some reason, maybe because it's so difficult to push d4. Of course, if you can push the pawn, that's a different story. Then you might be better and so on. The bishop is happy, no matter if it's light squared or dark squared. But if you can't do that, well, you will end up in some kind of strategic inferiority. And that's what happened in the game. I would like to show you first what happened in this game between Oparin with the white pieces and playing black Esipenko. So what Esipenko played in the game, he played normal move. Let's see here, bishop e6 I thought he had played, but let me see, I'm trying to find the game here. It was a very impressive game, Did he play bishop e6? Yeah, I think so. He played bishop e6 in the game, defending the pawn. White played rook ad1, and after... Is that the way the game went? No, sorry, I'm wrong. Yeah, this would have happened in this case. Yeah, white puts more pressure on the pawn on d5. We pick this rook so that the other rook avoids any tactical surprises with knight takes f2. No, he didn't play that in the game. He took on c3 in the game. Esipenko, he took on c3 in the game, I think. And white noticed that if knight c3, there is d4, of course. So white, they don't want to take with the pawn, because in that case, maybe black gets some counterplay against this pawn at some point. So Oparin took back with the queen here. After bishop g4, as we were saying, black is happy to trade off their bishops, but here one bishop will remain on the board. White played h3 after Bishop takes e2. You can include rook c8, but then I can just go queen b3, and that's even a better square. So bishop takes, knight takes, queen d6, rook ft1. White starts piling up against the d pawn. Rook ad8, rook d3. Why does he go 2 steps? Why not just 1? Well, you will see very soon. Rook d7, rook ad1. What white is going to do next here, they're actually going to bring one more piece to attack the d5 pawn. Guess who will attack the pawn apart from the 2 rooks? Yeah, okay, we will get there soon. Queen c6, queen b4, no thanks. We don't want to trade and help black to improve their pawn structure. Rook ed8, knight c3. Always white is looking carefully at the move d4, but it's not working, it seems. White has so many pieces there. Bishop c5, queen g4. Why did it go exactly to g4? Well, you will see after bishop e6, white played rook 1 d2. And now you can see the point. This is actually something I've seen in Karpov's games, I think. Karpov had some game like that against Spassky, where he arranged a little train, you could say, along the d file. So that happened in this game also. Maybe Oparin and me, we looked at the same game, who knows. b4, bishop b6, and queen e1. Beautiful, beautiful the way white has played here. Look how he's piling up against the pawn. School example, you could say, about how to fight against IQP. No chance anymore. We don't have a piece which can cover that pawn. So black lost the pawn, white went on to win. You can see d4 not tactically okay, because we will take... technically, you can't take back, but if you try it, you could argue that you would hit the knight. But as you can see, there is tension against the rook also, so that can never work. So the pawn is lost, white will take it, and they will have a very big advantage here. So please notice in this final position, I mean, not of the game, but within our analysis, please notice that if black had another minor piece, if they had the other bishop, it would still be boring position for them, of course, not what we want exactly. Such positions, they have also been held in today's practice. You can hold such positions, but they're extremely unpleasant. White can start working on a second weakness, perhaps, maybe something on the queen side, maybe like some old Botvinnik game, you can start something on the king side, who knows. But okay, black has better chances of defending with the other bishop. But the piece that black would really like to have here, which piece do you think we're talking about? Aha, a knight. If black had a knight on f6, I'm convinced that it would be a different story. They would still be worse, but the knight is much smarter in this structure. It's much more dynamic. It's protecting the pawn, but it's also ready to go to e4 at some point. It's also protecting the rook on d7, by the way. So basically, you could say black was unfortunate to end up with the wrong pieces here in this case. So what should they have done instead? Well, we'll come to that now. They should try to keep this knight in the first place and not take, I think, on c3. That's not correct as I see it. Bishop g4, this was a very interesting option for black. If f3, of course, we will take, and then you can see that the pawn on e3 is weak. So white could play something else here, something like h3, for example. We will hurry to trade off the bishop. Bishop takes e2, knight takes, but we won't trade off our proud knight. This guy must stay, that's definite, though it's the best minor piece we have here. Queen d6, for example, getting ready to play rook d8. We have the bishop coming to c7, the typical battery. Let's say rook ad1, rook ad8. Bishop d4 maybe. We could trade, and we will get to the other variation, basically, but in a much better version, thanks to our good knight. But bishop c7 is even nicer. We're playing a little for an attack now. Let's say g3, white is going to be careful about the mate on h2. They play something like g3. We can play a pawn move. Which pawn move do you like here? Exactly. This is a good move for various reasons. Now we gain space. We clear a square for the king in some back rank situation, but also, most importantly, we're about to play h4. White will play h4 probably to avoid that, and we play something like queen g6. So please notice which kind of position you have here compared to the other position. We have a lot of activity. They are far away from capitalizing on the IQP. You can even consider some kind of sacrifice at some point here, maybe, if you can make the tactics work. Or maybe you can invade with the queen, something like that. So basically, this is what I think is the right approach here. We have the IQP, we have it on the board, but we don't confine ourselves to passive defense. It makes sense to get that other bishop off the board, and then we try to bring the pieces quickly to the action, and we keep the knight on e4. I think this is a key consideration here. Knights, they really like the IQP structure. I think it was Grandmaster Baburin who said that in his book about pawn structures, I think. So I think this is the best choice here, bishop g4. We don't want to trade off, definitely not the knight for the bishop. Those pieces should stay. both of them from black's perspective. Our best move here would be bishop g4. We get ready to take on e2, and we keep our proud knight on e4. All right, let's continue. Let's speak about another facet of exchanges in our next example, in this game between Gravinsky with white and Posny with black. Gravinsky just put the bishop on g5. You can see their intentions here in this position. They would like black to take. They will take back. They will hit h7. They're also ready to play queen h4. If black plays g6, there is queen h4, hitting the pawn again, and the knight could reroute to f6. Yeah, here we're actually talking about king safety. Yeah, black has a problem with king safety. So what to do about that? Well, in the game, Posny said, all right, I can't really avoid the trade of bishops. It's impossible for the bishop to escape. I don't have the possibility to play something like g6 and bishop d7, but I can trade on my terms. So he played a very funny move here, you could say. He played the move bishop d8. Wow, interesting. Now, what he's trying to do here, basically, he wants white to take on d8, and then he will take back on d8, believe it or not, with a knight. So why does he want to do that? Well, basically, he's interested in putting the bishop on c6. And also he's avoiding some pitfalls on the king side. Now if white goes knight g5, what he had noticed here in the game was that, again, he doesn't want to play g6 due to queen h4 and this knight maneuver. He's going to play f5, which looks like inviting the thief to the house here after queen d5 check. But we can then play king h8, and thanks to this great defensive knight, we have bishop c6 coming up next. We can kick away the knight. Nothing's really happening now, thanks to this, you could say, goalkeeper on d8. So that's what he played in the game. He played here bishop d8, saying, all right, I'm fine with trading bishops, but on my terms. If you want to trade, we can do it like that. I will take like this with a knight. On other occasions, maybe you could use this idea to introduce your rook to the battle, but here it's about something else. He's somehow trying to safeguard the pawn on f7. So what else could black have done here? Yeah, another move, it was interesting to ask the computer about this. It wanted to play knight e7. And I thought this was interesting because it brings us to another topic within trades. This is what I call dynamic trades, where we trade the pieces in a way which changes the pawn structure, hopefully to our favor, right? So if they take on f6, we take back. We have compromised a little our pawn structure, but we can put the knight on g6 maybe, and maybe, just maybe, we were able to even play f5. Not that I like this very much on the surface, but, well, if Stockfish said it was okay, it's worthy of attention, right? So looking a little further, something like rook a1, knight g6, queen e3. Seems to me that white is slightly better, but maybe the queen can come here. But I think the computer was saying that, okay, we put the bishop on c6, for example. Maybe the knight can come to f4. It's interesting, no? We took in this way, we weaken our king a little, but on the other hand, we're also strengthening our center, and if we manage to push f5, who knows, maybe it's even better to have the pawn there. It can go to f6 and protect the other pawn, things like that. So that's an interesting idea also. In any case, in the game, Posny played bishop d8, and after bishop takes, knight takes. We saw this variation with knight c5, f5. In the game, they played here bishop d3. Black now played g6 because f5 loses a pawn here, queen d5, and this pawn falls. One way or another, you can see that knight f7, we have cheap tactics here with white. Exactly, we can take on e5. I think actually in both ways. But this, I think, is the flashiest way to take. So that if rook takes, we take with a knight. And as you can see, if they take on e7, we take on e5, we take on d7. So that's not what black would like to happen here. They don't play f5, they played simply g6. Now it's different because, yeah, they're not in time to carry out this idea, I think, because if queen h4, we go bishop c6. Yeah, they can carry it out, but we're just in time to stop the knight maneuver because, yeah, this is the game. Knight e5, black played f6, and after knight e4, we're actually back in chapter 22 maybe, defensive exchanges, if I'm not mistaken. That knight cannot be tolerated, right? You're completely right. We should get rid of it. Bishop takes, bishop takes. Superficially, it looks like white is much better here. They will put the bishop on d5. But please remember the first example in this chapter. Please remember Tal Najdorf. What did Najdorf do? What was that example about? Oh, yeah, he had a knight. He tried to improve it. Which square did he like to put it on? Exactly in the center. So that's the same thing here. After king g7, prophylactic move, bishop d5, knight c6. Black is actually doing the same thing as Najdorf, but in an even better version. They will put their knight on d4. I cannot honestly believe that the knight on d4 would be worse than the bishop on d5. I would say both of them are really good pieces, but the knight in the center, that's always great. So black was okay here. Later on, they saved half a point in this game. So I thought it was a slightly unusual example. Maybe the computer was not completely agreeing with this, but I thought it was something that we can learn from. You can see here the grandmaster, he didn't just blindly take on g5. He looked for other options. Maybe he looked at, I don't know, queen d8 also, could consider in the same spirit. But maybe there is something with, I don't know, rook d1, maybe something with the pressure on the d file that he didn't like or something. And then he found this very smart move, bishop d8, very creative move, like inviting the opponent to trade. Yeah, if they don't trade, we can play f6, right? And we kick away the bishop. So we're saying, okay, you can trade if you like, but then you help me to improve my knight, even if it goes backwards. I think it's actually improving the position here. All right, let's look at something more complex. Here we're talking about accepting the trade on our conditions. We saw something about dynamic exchanges also taking with a pawn like Stockfish wanted with g takes f6. But now I would like to talk about something more difficult when we avoid exchanges, because this is also important. Just as we know that some trades, we like them, like in Panzer's example, he played bishop b4, he traded off his bad bishop. And the same thing happened with Chedlishvili, who played bishop b5, if you remember, trading off his bishop in that French structure. But here we have the opposite coin, because here, in this game between the white pieces Mamadzada and playing black is Ivic, you can see that black's situation here long run is really uncomfortable. White has the bishop pair, white has the very strong center. If they can play d5, it's basically time to pack our bags, strategically speaking, of course. Very, very tough situation for black. Don't look too much at black's extra exchange. White has a pawn for it, and also it's not a rook-friendly position, as you can see. Not a single open file for the rooks right now. So unfortunately, the grandmaster in this example, he made a bad choice. He traded the queens. This just helped white to improve their position, to carry out, to execute, to convert their advantage. We can have a quick look at the game if you like. He played queen c6, and after queen takes, knight takes, bishop f4, you can see white is already trying to play d5, for that reason knight e7, e6, now we can start pushing the other pawn and help our bishop to become stronger. Rook f6 was played. If knight e5, I think Mamadzada had prepared to play rook e1 with the threat of e7, and if black takes, obviously you can see that also the pawn on f5 is a weakness, right? It can be attacked and so on with the rook coming to e5. So after the move e6, black played rook f6, rook e1 protecting the pawn, king g8, king f3. White can do the same thing. Please notice with queens on, that's not possible, really, because black's queen will be attacking white's king. King f8, b3, very nice move. We're opening up the game so as to help the bishop we would like to take back, and later on play something like d5 at some point. Pawn takes, I was going to say, but I think if you take, we can just take back with the bishop, and it's very unpleasant for black, I think. I don't know, maybe rook c8, you can protect the pawn. Ultimately, you will try to play d5 and d6. Yeah, looks horrible for black. They played in the game rook c8, and after pawn takes, rook takes, bishop d2. Oh, very nice. So she's about to play bishop b3. Later on, there was d5, and white had just a crushing advantage. It was impossible for black to parry these passed pawns. The bishop pair is very strong. You can see that sometimes you can even perhaps reroute the bishop to a3 if you can cope with the defense of the c-pawn in some way. This was a nightmare for black. Yeah, you can even imagine, you're right, you can even bring in the king at some point maybe. Very, very difficult position for black. They should not trade the queens, in my opinion. When you're having a worse position long term, very often that's the piece you should keep on the board. Keep the queens. That's the piece which can generate counterplay. Even speaking of just psychology, I mean, leaving apart the objective part of chess, if you keep the queens on, the practical part, you have more chances of confusing your opponent, making them expose their king or something. So keep the queens on if possible. I looked at one variation here. It's very complex, but I hope you will enjoy it anyway. So first things first, we should prevent d5, so we should play queen d7. Let's say white plays b3, just like in the game. They would like to open up the game. If they don't do that, I think one plan here might be to push the pawns and hopefully put the knight on d5 and create some counterplay. We have to open up some space for our rook, right? So I looked at b3, a takes b3 and bishop takes b3. We know this from the game. One more move and it's bye-bye. It's hopeless. So a5, we fight back, right? Now if d5, we can go a4. This helps black. These complications help black probably. Yeah, I looked at this. It's with the computer there. We looked a little at this. e6, queen d6, bishop f4, queen c5, and black is just holding here, you can see. they are trying to undermine white's pawn center. So let's say white play here a4. The point of this move simply to win a tempo to save the bishop. Pawn takes bishop a2. At this point you can see again white is very close to achieving d5. This cannot be tolerated, or at least if we tolerate it, we need something in exchange. So what can that be done? Not so really easy to see how to enter on the queen side. What can we do on the queen side? But look at the king side. Aha. Time is money. We can actually give up something here in order to speed up our counterplay. Exactly, f4. That's a very nice move. You can see that now if they take with the pawn, I think the king becomes very weak, right? If you take with the pawn, I think you can play something like knight f5. And for starters, we have some tricks coming up on that side, right? On the other hand, if they take with the bishop, then we can... Oh, by the way, if they play g4, that's a good question. Yeah, what if white just closes the doors? So I looked at this also. Here is a crazy variation, rook c8, you could say, but now, what if d5? Well, look how this changes the position. What does the insertion of these two moves mean? g4 and the inclusion of these two moves, g4 and f4. Think back, please, about the chapter about intermediate moves, and you will notice, aha, suddenly there is some kind of tactical motive with the king being exposed to queen takes g4. How could black exploit that? You got it. Rook takes c3. Very nice. Queen takes and queen takes g4. So sometimes when you analyze with chess engines, it can be very useful. You just have to be patient and try to understand their moves also. Why was the computer so happy about playing f4? What if I go g4? And then he will tell you what he had in mind. Obviously, this would not work without including f4 if you go rook c8. Immediately, I think white will have time to play d5, and if f4, they would play something else. They will maybe take with the bishop. While if we play f4 first, if you see what I mean, if we f4 first, we're waiting for information here. They have 3 different ways of reacting, and we will do different things depending on how they reply. That's what I call flexibility. So if they take with the bishop, that's our main line, right? Now we play rook b8. You can see the idea. Suddenly, they can't cover b2 because their bishop is pinned on the f file. So that's some kind of flexibility thinking. They do this, I do that. But if they do that instead, I will do this, and so on. All right, let's see here. Queen d2, rook d2, covering the square on b2, and we can play here the move queen f5. Yeah, why do we play queen f5? I was trying to understand. Yeah, you will understand next turn. Yeah, looks like if we are done here already, but now time for counterplay. So we are about to get eliminated here after d6. How could you possibly cook up something? Aha, you got it. Last resource here, g5. Very nice. As you can see, they cannot move the bishop due to the pin. They can take en passant. We'll take with the knight. And okay, I admit it's still a very complex position, but I think black should be happy about this outcome because the game is very complex. All black's pieces are active. They have a target here. White's king is still a little weak and so on. I think this is a good outcome for black, but okay, I agree. It's the computer who is telling us to play like this or that, but I think we can learn from it. The computer managed this way or that way to cook up counterplay. That's what we really need here, but in the first place, it's important not to trade the queens here. Keep the queens, please. We need them in that position. I mean, if we go back to the position after d5, I think it was here at the very end, just for you to notice, if you move away the queens, if you remove them from the board, it's almost resignable for black. If the queens were not there, I mean, we really need them for the sake of counterplay. That would be the final lesson in this game. Queen d7, very important. We should keep the queens on and try to cook up counterplay one way or another, right? And try to hold up the move d5. So that's about it in this example. Very interesting about avoiding the trade of queens. Let's have a look at our next example. I think we will talk very briefly about pawn play. We have that in the next chapter about revolution. So I just included one example here about pawn play. But we saw actually some ideas including pawn play. For example, you remember that h5, h4 move in Leko Gurevich, no? So we had that at a few moments to gain space and help the rook and so on. In this game between Christensen with white and Sivuk with the black pieces, you can see that white has more space. They're more active. They're about to play rook ad1 next. We have a problem piece on g7. The knight is also not very happy at this point, but Sivuk noticed a way to help basically all his pieces. He used pawn play for that reason. Something about pawn chains. When the opponent has a pawn chain, you can sometimes try to break that chain. Maybe g5 would be a little too optimistic. White would play rook ad1, and if takes, also you can see that black's king would be exposed, but he played instead the typical French move. It's not French at all, but still the same move, familiar from the French, exactly. f6, trying to open up the game for for black's pieces. After e takes f6, knight takes f6, you can see that already we have a weakness, of course, on e6. But at the same time, our bishops are now very happy. I mean, the other one was happy from the very beginning, but here, this bishop is also happy. By the way, if you try to play in, you could say, more slower fashion, we will come to that in the next chapter. We will talk about evolution and revolution. Evolution, when you slowly improve your position, and revolution, when you take drastic measures. So if you slowly try to improve here, you play something like knight b8. This will take a long time. It will take a long time to make this work. White would be able to, I don't know, maybe rook d1. You would play something like knight e4. If they go knight c6, you would go knight e6. This would be very unpleasant for black in the long run. They would improve the knight, but the position as such would still be difficult. So I like what they played in the game a little more. f6. It's time for drastic measures, you could say. After e takes f6, knight takes f6, white played rook a1, and we play here queen e7 simply. White notices that there are some dangers here on the sky. If bishop f3, trading off the bishop, strategically well-founded. This bishop was very strong, but after bishop takes, rook takes, what do you think black would play? Exactly, knight c4, we have tactics coming up now. Our bishop is really strong in the structure, and white is like a little regretting also that they played f4. So that could happen in the event of bishop f3. King h1 was played in the game. Rook a8. Let's fight for the open file. White took on d8. It's not so nice for them to play bishop f3 because we could then trade off on f3 and we take the open file, right? Bishop takes, rook takes. We take before they get a chance to come back. We take and we bring in the rook to d8, and we have the same ideas. Like for example, knight e4. Who knows, maybe something with the bishop also in the future, or maybe invade with the queen. A little unpleasant for white, the rook is not so well placed on f3. So they took on d8 in the game, rook takes, rook d8, trying to simplify in order to keep the balance. I would say it's even black who's a little better here thanks to their more active bishops. And here Sivuk played a very nice game. We're back to Miguel Najdorf, we're back to improving knights. How can that be done? Knight e8. Beautiful, beautiful. He's trying to bring the knight to d6, f5, d4. Very, very nice and impossible to stop, basically. Rook takes, queen d2. No thanks. We don't want to trade queens. On this occasion, it's not because we have some kind of strategical inferiority. It's about the simple fact that we consider that their king is weaker than ours. We want to keep the queens on for attacking purposes. So queen e7 was played in the game, queen d3, knight e6, b3. White is trying to safeguard their weak spots. Knight f5, we're continuing with our plan. Bishop d2, and here, bishop f2, sorry. And here black played a very nice move, bishop d4. Why do we play that? White trade off the nice fianchetto bishop for that passive bishop. Well, actually it's again about defending what do you say, aggressive exchanges. We want to trade off the defender on f2. This is a strong defensive piece. It's keeping away black's queen. A very good move, because now after bishop takes d4, they should have avoided that. We talked about avoiding exchanges. Bishop e1 was the last chance here to keep the bishop on the board. It's of course ugly to let black have this bishop, but it was more important to prevent queen h4. In the game they played bishop takes d4, and after c takes d4, knight e4. What do you think black played next? That's right, they had a killer move here. They found a killer move. You'll see moves like knight e3, queen b4, and so on, but there is an even stronger move. Yeah, by the way, queen b4, we can play queen d2. You remember the lifeline, right? The queen is undefended on b4. However, they played here queen h4. Beautiful. You see what's going on here? We have this coming up. We have, that coming up, knight e3 coming up next. On top of it, maybe knight e3 in some variation, and even queen takes f4. So many things for white to care about here. They played in the game king g1. After queen e1, black won the game. White resigned because simply they're dropping the bishop on e4. You can take it in whichever way you like. So what happened here was that the position looked a little better for white. They had more space. They had a more active position, but black noticed that by attacking the opponent's pawn chain, in this case by means of f6, they were able to liberate themselves a little. They accept a slight weakness on the e6 square, but at the same time their bishop and knight become much happier once we open up the game for them, and black was later on able to maneuver the knight to a better place in the center. I would like to at this point move on to the last part of this, you could say, little group of strategic actions. We're talking about the three different facets of prophylaxis, you could say, or, well, not really, no. We're talking about restriction, prophylaxis, and provocation. They have something in common, a focus on the opponent's play, but then there are big differences as for what they are supposed to do. So in this case, for example, we're playing with the black pieces, Vidit with white, and Yakuboyev with the black pieces. This is about restriction. We notice something that the opponent would like to do, and we try to take measures against it, but we try to prevent it. We don't let them physically carry out their idea. So if you're playing with the black pieces here, I'll tell you that white just played queen f3. What do you think white is up to? Well, not very difficult to understand this, right? Of course, they played queen f3 to unpin the knight along the e-file, and also because they are interested in playing knight f5. That's a nice square for the knight. It could travel further to d6, nice little square in the middle of black's camp. Also some ideas maybe with queen g4, some tactics targeting the pawn on d7. By the way, the pawn on h5, that's a nice feature, modern feature, you could say. It's a strategy to push those rook pawns. So what do you think? What should black do about that? Can we somehow allow knight f5, or should we prevent it? Yeah, I looked at a few different moves here, but if you carry on in like, what can I say, relaxed way, if you play something relaxed, let's say something like rook fe7, well, white could then try to bring in their plan. They could start with h6, and then, yeah, actually they won't bring out their plan because the rook is hanging, but h6, yeah, actually not a good example, but it's a good move, of course, h6. It shows the dark side to rook a7. Black stopped to defend the pawn on f6. No, I wanted to say something else. Yeah, if black plays something more relaxed, let's say something like b5 and a5, b4, now white would definitely carry out their plan. Knight f5 and the knight will come to d6 next turn. We don't like this with black. So what Yakuboyev did was very simple. He just said, I can't tolerate that knight on f5. He played f5 himself. That's what I call restriction. You just say, stop, I don't allow this to happen. Of course, you're right saying that we soften up the square for the bishop, but he noticed something tactical. We talked about this very briefly also. There is some kind of connection between strategy and tactics. You can't really get very far in the strategical battle if you don't consider tactical ideas. So bishop e5, you got it. It's a big mistake due to rook takes, pawn takes, and d4. Discovered attack, we're taking the knight because the queen is also in the air. So that's of course something that we have to notice. We can not just say f5 is bad, I weaken the e5 square. Well, we have to be a little more, what can I say? We have to see a bigger picture. This actually helps us also. Who knows, maybe this pawn will advance one day also. So it's not the end of the world that we soften up this square for their pieces. All right, let's see the game. They played knight f1, and here, now they're about to play bishop e5, so black quickly played here, you got it, using, I call this an entry square. When you have an open file, you try to find squares which are protected by your pawns. So here, Yakuboyev played rook e4. Very good move, because if white takes, well, we can take with this pawn perhaps, and we improve our pawn structure. Bishop e5 was played in the game, knight e6, we're improving the pieces. White played queen d1 because they know that maybe knight e5 is coming up next. Some idea with f4, f3, black might even play for an attack here. They played queen d1, and after rook takes e1, queen takes e1, black played key move here. We talked about this very recently. Before white gets a chance to play something like f4, closing the doors on the king side, black hurries to play here the move f4 themselves. As you can see now, even f3 is coming up. Suddenly black is having some kind of attacking potential on the king side. White played f3 and black played here h6, which means that we are fixing the weakness here. We're also preparing to go knight e5, having the knight in the protected place. And I would say, generally speaking, it's never wrong to have an extra square for our king. Queen h4 was played in the game, rook f5. Now we're getting ready perhaps to attack this pawn. And I think what white should have done here was to give up that pawn exactly. They should have played here knight h2. This is what we looked at in chapter 27, defensive sacrifices. We give up that pawn, knight h2, queen f7, knight c4. They can have it. It's on the house, rook takes h5 and queen f2. Black is right now a pawn up, but you can see white has a clear plan here. Who would like to use that square? Exactly, the knight. We will move away the bishop somewhere, and we will try to plant the knight on e5. And then we can also play something like rook e1, and we have some counterplay. Not clear how black progresses here, even if they have an extra pawn. This would have been preferable for white in the game. Vidit unfortunately played g4. This was too dangerous. Can you see how Yakuboyev reacted? Now we're talking attacking play. We're back in chapter 19. Sacrifices in the attack. Exactly. We're on the attacking side. Rook takes e5, of course. Very nice move. D takes e5. And knight e5 was also very nice here. But he played d4 first, opening up more space for his attack. knight h2, protecting the pawn on f3. Black continued to run with the d pawn, rook d1, knight g5. Black had a very nice game here. For starters, you can see that queen f2 is completely impossible due to knight h3. And we have other ideas such as invading with the queen and so on. Black is definitely for choice here, and they later on went on to win this game. So this example, I wanted to show you simply something about how we can stop our opponent's plans in the first place. We don't let them carry them out. Knight f5 was definitely high on white's wish list here. This is what they would love to play, improving the knight and opening up for the rook. We could look for different ways of taking prophylactic measures, but it didn't really seem to the point here. It's better to stop it at the very beginning. Yeah, by the way, g6, don't even think about it, right? Knight e4, the knight is getting very strong. So f5, safe to say, best move here, preventing white's plan. On the other hand, in our next example, it's quite the opposite. We are sitting here with the black pieces, again, Krivoruchko with white, and playing black Fedoseev. You can see that white's having an IQP, and they are about to play, of course, d5. We can't really stop it this time. We can't do like Yakuboyev, preventing the opponent's plan. We can't put something on d5, for example. And our knight is not on f6, where it would prevent this plan. So we will have to live with d5 on the next move. So the question is, what can we do against it? And what Fedoseev noticed here was something, I would say, something unusual, because you would say one of white's assets here is the bishop pair. You would like to trade it off. Oh, I see, we can play bishop f6, and if they play d5, we can then trade off the bishop. But even that would be nice for white. After all, the d5 move is a key idea in this AQP structure. So what he noticed was that he can actually bring about another pawn structure. He will let white play d5, but then he will block it. He will block the pawn. He will not let white trade off these pawns. He will push e5. For that to happen, you got it. We have to play bishop f6. And after d5, he was not interested in this. Bishop takes, queen takes. You can see white has a dream advantage here. The bishop is very nice. In an open position, it doesn't hurt that black has put their pawns on light squares. So what did he play? Of course, you got it. After d5, he played here e5, keeping things closed. And now white's bishop pair is not so impressive anymore. And at the same time, look at that blocking knight on d6. Yeah, a great piece. And you can see, as for black's strategical ideas, it's not really difficult. The distribution of the pawns tell us that we have 4 pawns on the king side. So definitely we're going to play f5 at some point. Maybe g6, bishop g7, and then go for f5, something like that. That's what happened in the game. White played here rook ac1, black played bishop g5, so as to prepare f5. Another idea would have been to play g6 and play bishop d7 and f5. But Fedoseev wanted to play in a faster way. What I noticed here was, I'm sure that Krivoruchko, he thought about it. There was this possibility, bishop takes e5, giving up the exchange, bishop takes, rook takes. This is what I would call revolution. No, we changed the position completely, or quite a lot. I'm not convinced that white has more than equal game here, or maybe black is even slightly better here, but I still think it would be an interesting try for white to play something like this. Maybe, just maybe, we can cook up some counterplay on the king side and so on. Maybe we can fight against black's blockade. Maybe this was a better choice. In the game, he played simply rook c2 and black played rook c8. As you can see in this way, yeah, they cannot take the pawn. Now the bishop is pinned. So queen e2 unpinning, rook e8, the last friend to the party. e4 is coming up now, bishop e2. And here you have an interesting moment, because Fedoseev knows that the rooks will be traded, but he says, yeah, I don't want to move away. These 2 pieces, the knight and the queen, they should stay where they are, so I should carry out the trade. I'm trading on my terms, so to speak. If you play something like f5, if you speed up the plan, you give white a golden opportunity. I'm convinced that Krivoruchko would have played here rook takes, queen takes, and then he would have taken on e5. Because this is evident when you feel that you're getting squeezed, when your opponent has all the play, you look for counter opportunities. So bishop takes e5 is very strong. Looks like it's a tactical mistake, but after knight f7 we can play f4, and after bishop takes, you can see that we lose the queen, but we get a nice position here. Bishop takes, rook takes, bishop takes, with an improved version, I would say, of the previous exchange sacrifice that we looked at. So this is something that black should avoid. Yeah, by the way, please notice in this variation that if you play f5, and you try to avoid this by taking away the knight, this is even worse because white will they won't think twice. They will just push d6 one way or another. This will be very good for them. Maybe they can take on e5. Maybe they have some check on a2, something like that. They're helped in multiple ways by this d6 push. Yeah, we must never allow that. It's the unblocking pawn advance, right, that we must not allow. So rook takes e2, very nice move by Fedoshev, not difficult, simply trading on our terms. Queen takes, and now he played f5. Black had a very nice game here. They continue with e4, bishop f6. They played on the queen side, on the king side, sorry, and they later on prevailed in this game. So what we have seen here basically is that Fedoshev noticed that he cannot stop d5. It's not like the previous example where they stopped knight f5 by playing f5. This cannot be stopped. We have to take prophylactic measures. He noticed that, okay, once they go d5, I should try to keep the game closed so as to not open up space for their pieces. How can I do that? Well, I must start with bishop f6, so after d5, I can actually move my e-pawn. I can advance my e-pawn to e5, and in this way, I keep my very nice blockading knight. And this pawn is like restricting white instead. All right, let's have a look at one example featuring provocation also in this game with the white pieces Idani and playing black is Berches. You can see that white has more space. They're about to play e5. Black is having a hard time here, you could say, defending. But actually black is better in this position, but only if you find the best move. Which is the best move? Well, it's a move which forces white to play a move that they don't want to play. So e5 is what they would love to play, and f5 is what they really dislike to play. That's not the move that they would like to play, f5, not at all, because it gives black the square on e5, and it leaves the e4 pawn as a weakness, where it will restrict all white's pieces. So how can we actually force white to play f5? Yeah, we have a sneaky move here. You found it already. Exactly. Bishop c8. Very clever move. Now they have to defend the pawn on h3 in some way. Knight g1 fails to bishop d4. We would then take on g1 at some point. Actually, whenever you give away your strong bishop like that, think twice about it, even if you win the exchange. But here it's not easy for white to cook up something. Also, you can see that black has some chances of maybe bishop e7 and some sacrifice, or there is some tactic coming up, or maybe even some move like f5, softening up white's light square. So not a good outcome for white. If you go h4, of course, you invite queen h3, and g4, as you can see, drops the pawn on f4. So in the game, unfortunately, Dani had to play f5. And this is the provocation measure. We have managed to provoke f5, a move that white did not want to play. Black, of course, put the knight on e5, a beautiful blockade in the center. White played b3. And here at this point, black asked themselves, well, I have a bunch of good pieces here, the knight, the bishop, the rook, and so on. But what about the bishop on c8? What will I do with this bishop? How can this bishop become a good piece here? You're completely right. We can't use it on this side. It's not useful on that side. We need to use it on this diagonal. How can we bring about that? We could play something like a5. I think he didn't play it because he didn't like knight takes, and bishop d3. White would try to set up a blockade here. I'm thinking, no, maybe bishop a6. They would take on a6, rook takes, queen d3, maybe try to put the queen on c4. White would try to erect some kind of blockade. So what he did, he speeded up this plan. He played first c4. Very nice, because now he's actually giving away a pawn, but he's securing a good bishop in the end. After knight takes, bishop takes, b takes e4. You can guess black's next move here, exactly a5. So now the bishop will come to a6. It will always have something to do. It will always be attacking that pawn on c4. Bishop e3, bishop a6, queen d3, rook a8. We bring all the pieces to defend that, to attack that pawn. White bring all their pieces to defend it. Rook e2, rook 3 e2 to bring the rook to c2. Queen c7. Rook c2. At this point, white is defending successfully, but we can insert this move bishop c3. As I was saying, always careful when you give away that bishop like that. But here, white cannot really cook up any counterplay. They would love to play something like rook takes, pawn takes, queen takes, bishop takes e4, and bishop e2. But as you can see, black could simply defend with f6, and unfortunately, white is missing more pieces, so like a knight on f4, maybe to put on e6, something like that. They don't have that, so it's difficult for them to create counterplay here. Black has already opened files to work on. So in the game, they played instead bishop d2, and now, as you can see, black is ready to move into a very superior endgame. They played bishop takes, and after bishop takes, queen takes, rook takes. You can see that this is difficult for white. The pawn on e4 is long-term target, or perhaps it will fall off very soon. Black has a passed pawn on the queen side, and so on. One interesting fact, I made a little experiment here. I put the pawn on f4, and I asked the computer about it, and it actually said that white had good chances for a draw by playing e5 at the right moment. So that's interesting also. They're really paying the price for this move f5. You can really say that even into the endgame, this provocation measure that Berches carried out here with bishop c8, it paid off even into the endgame. This was very, very useful because we're forcing them to play a move that they don't want to play, f5, which ruins their plan of e5, their big plan of playing e5. It's ruined completely. They instead end up with a weak square on e5, like a stronghold for our pieces. So nice, very opportune move by bishop c8. You only get such a chance once, and he definitely took it in this game, Berches. All right, our last example, I just wanted to highlight something about keeping a tactical eye when you're in the middle of the positional battle. Sometimes we tend to forget, I think all of us, a little about tactics. When we have some kind of sharp position, we immediately think about tactics, but then as the game approaches the end game and so on, maybe we get into a different mood where we're like slowing down our tactical vision. And that's something we should be careful about, because keeping a tactical eye, it can win and it can save many games. And here we have one nice example where the white piece is Markus and playing black is Atalik. You can see that white is having a nice advantage here. They're playing on the queen side. You can see that what they would like to do here, they would like to trade off pieces on the queen side. They would like to attack black's pawns on b4, especially the pawn here also. If they can trade off the queens, they would try to bring over the knight somehow. Yeah, it would have to go back for that purpose, but you can imagine maybe it can do something like that. Maybe we can even bring in the king. But okay, this can only happen if queens are off, right? So black would love to keep the queens on, but that looks grim because you can see where black's queen is. It cannot move away from the trade, so to speak. White is forcing the trade. So in the game, what black played, I think they just played a6. Unfortunately, this is basically like resigning the game. Strategically speaking, queen takes, bishop takes. Markus hurried to trade the pieces here. Rook takes, rook takes, rook takes, bishop takes. And he walks down with the king. I have seen this several times in the Catalan. It's a typical Catalan picture. Somehow white's king gets there faster. I think my famous compatriot Urvandoson, he used to do that also, bring in the king quickly. King f2, h6, knight f3, knight e7, bishop d4, restricting the knight so that it cannot come to c5. This is what I call the magic distance, by the way, something like that. King f7, king e3. We're ready to continue the king's march. Bishop d8, king d3. You can see where the king is aiming at. g5, king c4. White has achieved their plan. Later on, they played knight e1, knight e3, I think, and they eventually they won this pawn. You can see that playing a5 just makes things worse now. Then the white king can continue to enter. So this is what you should avoid. I think Atalik, what he looked at here was this move, bishop e3, which is also interesting. But as you can see, white would basically play the same way here. However, please notice they cannot take on b6. Now we're talking tactics, no? Rook takes e2, intermediate move. They cannot play like that. They would have to take first on c7. And only after that, rook takes. Now they will trade the queens. Queen takes b6, and we're back on the same page again. Bishop takes, rook takes, bishop takes, and we're ready to bring in the king here. Yeah, we can play bishop d4 first, and then we can continue with the same business as in the game. So, what do you think black missed here? Was there some incredible possibility to save the game? I will give you a hint. We are used to looking at the part of the board where we suppose that the main action is. Right now, I think we are looking at this part of the board, right? This is what we are looking right now, something like that, trying to figure out some good move there. What if I told you that the right move is executed in this corner of the board? It would not be expected, right? It's rather unexpected. But here that is true. They have a crazy move here which would have kept the balance. You got it. Bishop g1. What a fantastic move. What is going on here? How can you play like that? Well, it's a matter of comparison. We just talked about the move bishop e3, right? We said that if bishop e3, white should take on c7 first, because if they take the queen, well, then we will take on c2. So if you put the bishop a little further away, you put it on g1, you can see the problem for white. Yeah, they can definitely not take like that. You got it. We are then mating them, right? That's why the bishop should go all the way to g1. They cannot take with the rook, of course. Then we take on c2. And ultimately, as we just discussed, queen takes b6 has the same problem. We will take on c2. As you can see, once the smoke clears here, you will see that black will be a lot of material up. If white rook takes, king takes, a takes b6, and so on, I think you're winning plenty of material there. So Yeah, tough case for white. If you play bishop d1, actually white will have to be very careful, and the best thing they can do here to cope with these multiple threats, it's actually to go back with the queen. They're even fortunate to have this move. Queen e2, they're protecting the rook and they're protecting against the mate. This means that actually black, they won't win anything. However, they are very happy to keep the queens on. Now queens stay on the board, right? So we take on c2, rook takes, and we can take again. Rook takes, queen takes. The trade of rooks in itself is not so bad if we can keep the queens on. Trade of rooks also means that white, for example, will have to be a little more careful about the first rank. When you have a space advantage, you have to maintain that space advantage, right? So here black would simply go back with the bishop, and this is the key point here. If you remove the queens from the board, you basically have the game again, right? When white moved over the king to the queen side and attacked those pawns. But here they won't be able to do that because we will always annoy them with our checks. We will bother them with checks one way or another. So let's say, for example, knight f3, get the pieces back to action. Queen c6, tying up white a little. Bishop d4, knight e7, something like that. I think the game will be perfectly fine for black. They have plenty of activity. I would take black for sure in this position. I like black's position, but I will, of course, not trade the queens. I'll keep the queens. I'll put my queen on d5, for example. Who knows if I'm able to cook up something on the king side, maybe, or there is some other trick that I can use, some queen e4 tactic or something like that. But you see what I mean. We have the queen on the board. It means a huge difference. We're a little back to this game, the game between, who was it? Mamadzada and Ivic, yeah, where black traded the queens and white got a very favorable endgame. This is basically about the same thing. We should know which pieces to keep and which pieces to stay and so on. But it's not like Atark didn't understand that he wanted to keep the queens. It was simply difficult to see this move. That's the main point of this example that I want to show you, that please don't forget about tactics. It's always present in the battle. Even the best strategical players, they need to think in tactical circuits also. So bishop g1, that's a fantastic move, but you can only find it if you are really in a tactical mood. Also, you don't lose that tactical bite, that you see some possibilities and so on beyond the strategical aspects of the position. All right, so that's it about positional defense. Let's have a look very quickly at all the things that we saw here. We started looking at some cases where we would improve the pieces. We saw how Najdorf had a slightly worse position here, bad pawn structure. He brought his knight to the center. Even if it was traded off, it helped him to somehow reduce white's pressure, and he could perhaps have saved the draw if he was a little more accurate in the last part of the game. We saw how Panzer got rid of his passive bishop. This was a good trade, you could say, if black didn't want to trade. Well, in that case also the bishop is getting stronger. You can see that white understood which were the pieces to stay and to go. And definitely this is a good way of improving your pieces. The bishop could perhaps even go to a5 on some other occasion, but it was important to help the bishop, and the pawn could do that. Similar to the next example, the pawn, the h-pawn, helped black's rook to get into the battle. Unusual way of improving our pieces, but perfectly possible in this case. It's actually a theoretical position. You can find a bunch of games in this position. So very important move, h5 to play h4, gain space, but also bring in the rook, helped that rook to become a good piece. It eventually landed on d4. Fantastic progress by black in this game. We saw how black could get rid of the bishop here, the French bishop. We're happy to trade it off, so to speak, no matter which white piece would be traded for it. This helps us long term, and you could say the knight is not inferior to the white bishop in the later course of the game. We saw that Gukes was very happy to trade off the knights because it was a position where the pawn structure dictates that white has an outpost on d6. If we trade off that knight, they can't really use the outpost anymore. I have seen this also in the Dutch Stonewall, for example. If you trade off all the minor pieces, the outpost on e5, it's not really relevant anymore, but those are for knights, right? So very good choice by Gukes, and he later on brought the game into rook endgame, where chances are usually higher when you're on the defending side, the chances for a draw, I mean. So very opportune decision by black. We saw in our next example, the IQP example, that black should think very carefully about which pieces to keep. Yeah, by the way, these examples are about trades, right? Which pieces to keep and so on. when we have the IQP, please try to keep the knight on e4 as long as you can. It's good to get rid of the other bishop, I think the last square bishop, but basically that's what we talked about. The nightmare is when white ends up with a knight versus a bishop and they put pressure on the deep d5 pawn. So that was a good move, apparently. Bishop g4. Yeah, I forgot to say also, of course, that knight takes d5, you can see it doesn't work, right? We take on e2. That was the tactical point of all this, that the queen is like overloaded on d3. So very nice opportune move. Bishop g4 would have made black's task a little simpler, I think. In our next example, Posny said, all right, I'm fine trading bishops, but on my turn, we will trade them on d8, which means I can take with a knight, and in this way I can like prophylactically safeguard my king side. The computer said, by the way, it's okay to trade bishops, but on f6 we will take g takes f6, dynamic exchanges. That's another interesting possibility for black here. We saw the opposite side here in this game. Mamadzada, Ivic. Mamadzada had a long turn, white has a long term advantage here with the bishop pair and the strong pawn center. Keep the queens on, please. Try to create opportunities on the queen side and the king side, but the queens should stay in this game because maybe our last chance in this game is to cook up some counterplay against white's king. So we really need to have the queens on the board. Also in the endgame, white's king could enter more easily if queens are off the board. We saw that Sivuk played f6 in order to help his pieces here. This was a good occasion for a pawn move, thinking about pawn play, striking against the opponent's pawn chain and gaining some space or getting rid of white's space advantage. This was important, else we could get squeezed here. If we just play slowly, they will play rook 81, 94, 96 and so on. f6, very opportune move to open up the game a little for our pieces. We saw in the last part, we were talking about restriction, prophylaxis and provocation. Here in this case, Yakuboyev didn't allow Vidit to play knight f5. He played f5 himself so that he would fight against the plan of knight f5. That was very timely little move by black f5. We saw Fedoseev do basically the opposite. He couldn't stop white's plan, but he took appropriate measures against it, prophylactic measures, so he could meet it in a good way. He played bishop f6 so as to prepare e5, keeping things closed. The pawn on d5 is now restricting several pieces, and black even gets the chance to go for kingside expansion later on in this game. We saw how Berches, cleverly enough, played bishop c8, forcing white into the unwanted move f5, a move they never wanted to play. They wanted to push the other pawn, the e-pawn, but he didn't give them a chance. Now, as you can see, white had to play f5, and then black was very happy to put the knight on e5. Yeah, mission completed, you could say here, strategically speaking. And finally, Atalik had this very nice move, bishop d1, completely unexpected, which shows that in the strategical battle, we should always keep a tactical eye awake, so to speak. There are so many things that can happen. Sometimes we are our own enemy, so to speak. We only think in strategical terms and we forget about little these crazy tactics like bishop g1. All right, thanks and see you in the next chapter.